Hey, thanks for stopping by. My name is Tyler, and today I am not making the video I was hoping I'd be making today, but failure is an important part of the learning process, so I want to make a video about it anyway. I did fail my certified Kubernetes security specialist on the first attempt, so that means I have a retake coming up in 4 days, and I want to talk about what went well on the exam and, of course, what didn't go so well, because clearly there were a few critical failures that led me to not passing this exam. So I want to kick things off on a positive note and talk about what went really well during this exam and what felt really good. So starting off, my experience with the PSI browser was amazing. Getting into the exam was super seamless. Taking the exam was great. I didn't have any copy paste issues or terminal lag like a lot of people complain about online when it comes to these Linux Foundation exams. So I was super thankful that I didn't have to worry about any of that when I'm not taking a test at a testing center. That is always something that I'm pretty concerned about. And then, contrary to my exam results, I actually felt really confident on a lot of these questions. I mean, probably 80% of them I felt like really rock solid on, and I was very confident in answering them. And the nice thing about that is I know I don't have a huge knowledge gap to cover, and we'll get into that more when I talk about what led me to fail this exam. But it's kind of why I scheduled my retake so soon, is because I knew that most of the questions I was so familiar with, and there's really only a couple that I have to brush up on. And unfortunately, the couple I had to brush up on were very, very heavily weighted, which getting those wrong just plummets your score. So, with the positives out of the way, let's talk about what happened. Why did I fail this exam? So, obviously, there's no two ways about it. There is a knowledge gap, and that is a result of me neglecting certain things. Like, one thing I did not focus on a lot was best practices in Docker images, because I was kind of like, oh, well, it's a Kubernetes exam. I don't think I need to know what the best practices are. Like, if they ask me to do something to a Docker image, I have no problem doing it. But as far as knowing off the top of my head what those best practices were, there was definitely a knowledge gap there. So that's on my list of things to study before my retake. So I definitely have a little bit of studying to do to fill that knowledge gap. Again, I don't think the knowledge gap is that big, because there were really only a few questions that I hit and I was like, ooh, I don't really know how to do this. But there were just a lot of questions where it was almost second nature answering them. Unfortunately, those weren't the highest weighted ones in the test, and a couple of the ones that were super heavily weighted were some of the ones that I had knowledge gaps in. So, along with those knowledge gaps, which is what I'll be studying in my 4 days until my retake, I also ran out of time, which is another huge factor in my score, because there was one question in particular which I've read online, not obviously like the exact question, but the category and the technology that this question is covering is very heavily weighted. It's Falco. I guess I'm not saying what the thing is, so I guess I can say it. But it was a Falco question, and I've heard those are very, very heavily weighted, and I didn't even get a chance to answer it. So let's talk about that as well. So on the CKS and CKA questions, for that matter, just like on the killer shell scenario tests, you have that initial command where you're setting your context, which, if you don't set that context, your entire question doesn't really count. And this is important to mention, because when I got to this Falco question, it was like my second to last question, and I kind of brushed over it because Falco is one of those things that I actually am highly confident on configuring. Like, I've done some of it at work. It's not something that I'm ever worried about configuring or troubleshooting. So I kind of brushed over it. I'm like, I'll do that last. We should be okay. And then the very last question was another very heavily weighted one, which I don't think I answered that correctly. So, like 0 for 2 for super heavily weighted questions. But anyway, I go and hit this last question, and I'm like, ooh, I don't feel great about this. And I definitely spent way too much time carefully looking through it when I knew I still had a big question left. So I'm like, I had like 10 minutes left in the exam, and I'm like, okay, I'll go back and do this one on Falco. And I'm starting to try to answer the question, and it's like, find the behavior, adjust some stuff, good to go, bing, boom. And so I was going through the process to solve this question, and I was like, where are my logs? There's no logs to look at. And I messed around with the Falco configuration for like 8 minutes. And I'm like, it just isn't, nothing is here. Why is nothing set up for Falco? And then, of course, when the exam timer said 1 minute left, I was like, I should double check the context I'm in because something doesn't feel right. And so I ran the context command and went did the process again, and everything was the way it should have been to solve that question. And it was kind of heartbreaking because I'm looking at my timer that says less than a minute left, and I'm looking at this question that I know how to solve, knowing full well I don't have a single chance on solving the question before the time runs out. So got 0 points on that question in particular. Again, I feel like it was worth like 10% of the exam because it, like, when you fail these tests by the Linux Foundation, you'll get a little report that gives you your top 3 worst domains. And what do you know? Monitoring was right at the top. So that question in particular, in running out of time on such an important, like, critical question, definitely played a huge part in my scores. So again, the two things that really hurt me on this exam was, number one, of course, there is a knowledge gap. I know I'm talking a lot about this Falco question because it is weighted heavily. However, that doesn't excuse that if I got every single other question right, I still would have passed the exam. That question is not everything. So I definitely have to go back and do a little bit of a review. On the upside, I'm pretty confident on which questions I didn't do well on and exactly what I need to drill into. However, to be on the safe side, I'm also going to do some light review on some of the topics that I still might have felt good on. And then, just as importantly, I need to work on time management. There were a few things I did on this first attempt because I was feeling really confident for the first like 12 questions that probably kind of killed me towards the end. Like, for example, I would go back through and double check my YAML manifests before clicking next on the question and like really manually validating the entire question again. And if I feel confident on an answer, I think I should probably leave that towards the end because one little error in a question is going to be 1 point versus running out of time and having to forfeit a question, and especially if it's a super big question, is going to hurt your score so much more. On top of that, I think if I run into a question that I don't know how to answer or at least answer it quickly, I need to just skip it for the time being and come back to it because in my case, when I brushed over Falco and said, okay, I know how to do that, that's not something I'm really worried about. And then I went and messed around with a question that I didn't really know how to answer. And if I'm honest, I probably didn't get many points for it anyway because I probably answered it wrong. That was a poor decision because if I had just done the Falco question initially, I would have gotten the points for the question I knew how to do rather than hoping to get some points on a question that I didn't know how to answer confidently. So that about wraps up my exam experience, but I also want to talk about specifically what am I going to be studying for these next 4 days. So, of course, I am going to go over Falco again, just almost out of principle, even though it's one of the things I feel really good on. I want to be able to do it very quickly. So gonna probably do a little bit of Falco. Another thing is audit logging. I'm not very fast on building those audit files. It takes me some time to set them up and configure them. And then if something does go wrong, I have to go through all the logs of the API server. So if I can just nail those audit files first try, I think that would help me a lot as well. The last big area I know I need to focus on is those Docker best practices and knowing how to set up images in a way that is secure on a deeper level than, oh, just make sure the thing's not running as root. So those are pretty much the big three that I'm going to be working on. Again, the rest of the stuff I'm not super worried about, but I'll brush up on it anyway, because it would be really unfortunate if next Monday I'm making a part 2 of this video, having to retake it again. If that is the case, it is the case. I will do it. It's part of the learning process, but of course, I don't want to have to do that. To leave things off on a positive note, though, I will say that with the Kubernetes certifications, you do get a free retake, so it's not costing me any money to retake it. With all that being said, I think I will leave it off here. Again, remember, failure is always an option, so not the end of the world. Not always fun to fail certifications, but you can always retake them, and that's exactly the boat I'm in. So expect a video like probably Sunday, because I'll get my results from it Saturday night, and hopefully it's in a different tone than this video. But with that being said, thank you guys for watching. Have a great rest of your week.